Hey, what's up? My name is Roush, and today I'm going to be showing you a Neuro bass generator rack that I made when I was messing around with some sound design the other day. Let's get into it. Before I start, I just want to say that, this was really inspired by EPROM. I was watching one of his streams the other day while he was messing around with Granulator, and he's such a beast. It was really cool to see. I'll leave a link to that stream in the description, and I would definitely recommend checking it out. And then the other thing is, if you're not sure what Granulator is and you want to get a better understanding of how it works, Mr. Bill has a great tutorial on that, and I'll also leave in the description. It just kind of goes over the basics of how, what grain size is, how file position works, and how the granulator actually works itself. Yeah, so without further ado, let's really get into it. All right, so this is what the rack sounds like. All right, so the basis of this rack is this this granulator right here. If I turn off all the other processing, the granulator just sounds like this. So obviously there's some pretty cool tones, but it's definitely not as beefy as when you add in all the processing. So first things first, I have pretty much all of the knobs that I kind of mess with the most when I'm doing sound design macroed to these knobs over here. You're more than welcome to mess with it, or you also can like drag around the file position, which is something that I find to be really cool when I'm messing around with sound design. So yeah, I just have the grain size map, file position, the spray, the time, which is actually really cool. When I was watching that EPROM stream, I actually saw him messing with the time a lot, and you can get some really insane tones out of it. Next, we get into like literally all of the processing for this, which is this big knobs rack. So when I turn it on, it takes the sound from sounding like this to sounding like this. So this is a ton of processing. Not necessarily in an order or with purpose, but the way it came out actually sounds pretty cool. So I'll turn off everything and kind of go through this step by step and kind of show you the thought process behind this. So the first thing I have here is I have this LFO and I have the rate mapped to this macro, and I have the morph mapped to this morph over here. I'm actually going to slow it down so it doesn't look like it's going as crazy. But yeah, so this macro right here is mapped to the LFO, which is then mapped to this auto filter, and this is where you start to get a ton of the vowel movement. Like without it, it sounds like this. And then once we add it back in, it starts to sound like this. Yeah, so that sounds pretty cool, I think. So the next thing that I added in was this reverb. And this is going to be accentuated more so once we add in all of these OTTs, which I'll get into in a second. Yeah, so pretty much just a reverb. I have it macroed over here, so dry, wet, decay, size, just like a regular reverb. So right off the bat, I have two OTTs that are at 100%, and that's really just to bring out the sound. With them on, it just sounds like this, and they're just stock OTTs. The next thing that I did is something that I've been doing a lot of recently, is just stacking a bunch of these OTTs 0%, so that essentially the signal will pass through the OTT, and because it's not coded perfectly, it'll mess with the phase, and then it'll give it this really cool disperser effect, which sounds like this. I'll turn off the reverb so you can hear it. If we turn them off, it sounds like this. And then if we turn them on, yeah, you can hear that it starts to get messed with a bit. And the next thing is just saturation to bring the noise back up, the sound back up, which sounds like this. Next, I'm just taking out some harshness. I originally had Soothe on here, but I'm going to give this rack away, so I took that out so that I would just be using only stock Ableton plugins, except for Granulator, which is just a Max for Live plugin. And this is just taking away some of the harshness. And then we start to get into adding a bunch of low end back into this sound. So what I have here is I have Corpus, and this is just adding a ton of low end beef. So for example, the song that I have in the Granulator is actually in E. So I could tune it to E, and then we start to get a sound that is like really beefy in the low end. And that sounds like this. All right, Alright, so the next thing in this rack is this EQ8, and it's bumped at 100 Hz by about 10 dB. And this is just to create this cool psychoacoustic effect where the low end is far louder than the high end, and you create this really cool perception that the sound is louder than it is. The next thing in the rack is we have a glue compressor with a bit of makeup gain to make it sound a little bit louder, and that sounds like this. Ableton's glue compressor only goes to about 0.5 dB or negative 0.5 dB, so I'm just having a utility bump it up another 0.5 dB. And then as you can hear, there's not a ton of high-end content in here. And that's largely in part because we're intentionally doing that with the Corpus, which is pretty much just a low-end resonator, or not a low-end resonator, but it is a resonator in itself, but it's on the low end. And then we're obviously bumping up the lows again. So what I have here is I have an erosion to add some high end back in, and this is also macroed so that you can mess with it over here. So without it, yeah, you start to get some of that high end frequency content back. All right, so the last thing that we have in this chain is we have this this rack that's called the starter rack. Essentially, this is just a saturator and an OTT that are macroed, so that I can just adjust parameters instead of going into the individual plugins. So as you can see, it's just pretty much just a basic OTT and saturator. And then I think this just adds that extra like 5% to the sound. So for example, without it, it sounds like this. And then with it. Yeah, so a lot of this rack pretty much is trial and error in messing around with the knobs that I have macroed here. So what I have in here, like I said, is I have my song Cherry Blossom that just came out. But what I think is the coolest thing is adding in a lot of harmonic content. So like adding full songs or adding beats, or maybe a song that you just started and you want to resample to create some Neruo basses for your drop. Adding in a bunch of harmonic content like drums and melodies and low end is going to get some really cool results out of this rack. For example, like let's say that I loaded in a different song. I have my other song Fracture that I can load in right here. Yeah, and if I load that in, it sounds like this. Alright, so the last thing I'm going to go over is playing around with MIDI and like going from, high octaves to low octaves and messing around with sound design that way. And so, for example, if I just play this and play like different octaves on the keyboard, you'll hear that you can get some really interesting and different harmonic results. So that would sound something like this. Yeah, messing around with MIDI is definitely a really cool way to get some unique sounds out of this. Yeah, so the really cool thing about this granulator in this rack is that if you put in your own beats and you're trying to create cohesive drops, you're going to be able to get some really cool Neruo basses that actually have the same tones and timbres as your song out of the Neruo bass generator. Alright, so that's the video. I have the rack as a free download in the description below. Again, big shout out to EPROM and Mr. Bill. I learned so much from them, and I wouldn't have been able to make this video if I hadn't watched other tutorials and learned from them. Yeah, so if you enjoyed, be sure to leave a like and subscribe, and if you want to see more videos like this, comment below and let me know. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.